Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Okar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Those of you who receive our weekly talk invitations already know that this session is pre-recorded. We recorded it earlier on Tuesday at 10 a.m. New York time. So you're watching it just a couple of hours later. This format allows us to accommodate the time difference and logistical challenges of live coordination. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Hohti, who is a professor of history of art and culture, and she specializes in Italian Renaissance fashion, textiles, and material culture. She's also affiliated with Aalto University in Finland, but she's connecting today from Florence. Professor Hohti, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm very happy. I'm very pleased to be speaking here. So thank you for everyone who's joining us to listen to this talk. And yeah, so
thank you. Yes, of course. The whole screen is yours, and we can't wait to hear all about it.
Thank you.
Of course.
Okay, so today I want to take you into the world of early modern fashion through a very specific and surprisingly revolutionary object, the knitted stocking. Drawing on my recent research in Refashioning the Renaissance project, I will explore two things. I want to explore how a new fashion for knitted stockings spread across early modern Europe. And secondly, I want to talk a little bit about how we can gain access to their cultural meanings and construction by combining archival research with historical hands-on reconstruction. My aim today is not only to show that knitted stockings were markers of fashion, skill, and technological innovation, but also to demonstrate that by materially reconstructing some of the objects that are lost to us, we can bring incomplete documentary evidence to life, fill the gaps left by fragmentary written and material records, and bring the non-elite makers and wearers back into the history of fashion. So, I will start with knitting in early modern Europe. Knitting was one of the key areas of technological innovation in early modern Europe. Although knitting on needles as a textile technique was not new, what was extraordinary about the practice of knitting in this period was that it developed relatively quickly from a domestic craft into a prosperous sector of commercial textile production. One of the most important developments in the knitting industry was the invention of knitted stockings. Already by the end of the 15th century, there were thousands of professional stocking knitters in Italy. The industry continued to develop all over Europe, and by the early 17th century, knitted stockings were available ready-made on the market in different shapes and sizes. The invention of knitted stockings not only shaped the knitting industry, but it also created a European-wide fashion. According to Cesare Vecellio, who was the 16th century compiler of the first printed costume encyclopedia, fashionable stockings knitted on needles and made of the finest silks were widely worn at his date in his hometown in Venice, especially, according to Vecellio, by gentlemen and merchants and by noble and rich youths. Visual images show the extent to which fine silk stockings were worn by European men and women of status and rank. In these portrait paintings from the 16th century, the young gentlemen are dressed in pink and red knitted stockings, and especially in Moroni's image on the left, we can see how the artist has captured the tiny stitches of the knitting in detail. Knitted stockings appealed to men and women, in part because they were elastic and much more comfortable than the traditional cloth stockings that had to be made by tailors. But they were also colorful, extravagant, and new. Fine stockings were on offer in fashion centers such as in Paris and Italy in many different styles and colors, and some of the color variety can be seen, for example, in this image, which depicts an evening ball at Valois court. Although the finest stockings, such as these, were associated with men and women of status, archival records show that the demand for knitted stockings was not limited to the privileged rich. Family probate inventories and private account books from the 16th and 17th centuries recorded pairs of knitted stockings in many different qualities and textures and wide variety of designs and colors, so that even common artisans, such as barbers, bakers, shoemakers, or innkeepers, might eventually appear in stockings of silk. A wool merchant from Milan, for example, complained in the 17th century that it seems that even people of the lowest grade, carried by their ambition, take shame in using stockings of wool, and they use instead those made of silk. While artisan stockings were not comparable in quality to the finest stockings worn by the wealthy elites, knitted stockings worn by the ordinary men and women were treasured objects of novelty and fashion. Our records show that they were often dyed in bright colors and variety of shades that corresponded with the very latest color fashions. The colors included specialized shades such as dove gray, silver, brown, golden yellow, milky white, medium blue, and aquamarine, such as this pair of silk stockings, which is mentioned in the postmortem inventory of the Florentine modest wine cellar Evandia. Now you can't see the actual marking on the, or maybe I can move this image a little bit like that to the left here. So this document records a pair of stockings made of filaticcio, which was this kind of spun silk made of waste silk materials used in, and it was described as used, and it was in the color of sea. Okay, I move this back to where it was. Right. The fashion for knitted stockings was also not confined to the most important centers of production, such as Italy, England, or France. The demand spread quickly across most of Europe, reaching as far as Scandinavia. The King of Sweden, Erik XIV, for example, seems to appear in his 1561 portrait in tight-fitting stockings made of red silk. The wide geographical dissemination of knitted silk stockings is evidenced also by surviving material sources. The mid-17th century hand-knitted silk stockings conserved at the Turku Cathedral Museum in Finland confirm that by this date, silk stockings had become a feature of dress also among families at the more peripheral areas of Europe. One beautiful and well-conserved example of these was found in the burial coffin of Elisabeth Bure, the wife of the Vice President of Court of Appeals, here seen on the right. Although it is not known where the stocking was originally made, surviving 17th century examples suggest that this stocking was similar in style and quality to some of the finest knitted stockings that were produced in England in this period. Fine hand-knitted silk stockings, such as that from Turku, were expensive fashion accessories. Silk stockings imported from Naples, which was then quite an important center of production for silk stockings, could cost as much as 7 scudi a pair, which was a sum close to 2 months' salary of a master craftsman. The growth and importance of the European knitted stocking industry from the 16th century onwards has been noted by early modern economic and social historians. They have studied account books and guild records and inventories, revealing issues such as how the stocking industry was organized, how raw materials were produced and then supplied to the knitters, and how knitting evolved in different parts of Europe and became partly mechanized with the invention of the stocking frame, which was invented by the British William Lee in 1589. But despite this extensive and valuable archival research, our knowledge of the actual stockings remains quite limited. Documentary sources offer little understanding of their original visual look or colors and sensory qualities. And we know very little about the experiences of making and wearing early modern knitted garments. What exactly was it that made stockings physically, materially, and visually so desirable and also very valuable in this period? And how and by whom were the stockings produced? So let's first talk about makers of stockings. Although the knitting frame had been invented already in 1589, stockings in this period were mostly knitted by hand. Historians have argued that the relative simplicity associated with the technique made knitting wool socks and stockings a suitable activity for everyone. They have suggested that thousands of individuals without any professional training, including women, children, and the elderly, were employed in the knitting industry by the end of the 15th century. The repetitive nature of the craft meant that simple socks could be easily knit by many as a side activity to gain supplementary income. Images such as the hosier by Annibale Carracci or of the shepherd who knits while watching his flock demonstrate how knitting could be carried out while working or walking outdoors. Although knitting for the commercial markets, at least in Italy, was carefully controlled by merchants and the guilds, archival records such as petitions submitted for the Florentine wool guild Arte della Lana shows that knitting was widely practiced illegally outside the guild system. The Florentine silk dyer Piero di Jacopo, for example, was charged 10 scudi in 1610 for knitting and dyeing a pair of red stockings of high-quality wool that he had not declared to the officials. Peasants and soldiers were also often charged with making stockings without appropriate licenses or failing to pay the duties set by the guilds. A shepherd named Raffaello di Giovanni, for example, was thrown in jail and his horse and sheep were confiscated after he had made and hidden 2 finished pairs of knitted socks and 1 pair that was still in progress. The penalties of illegal practice of knitting could be severe. One man called Pierino from Castagno for a period of 5 years after he had been caught smuggling through the customs in Florence a white knitted wool sock. Although most stockings knitted by peasants or children without specific training were probably relatively ordinary socks and stockings of wool, documents indicate that silk stockings were also produced by women at home. Since thin silk material was delicate and expensive, and the construction was often complex, knitting fine silk stockings required a high level of skill and care. A document recording commercial activities in Milan from 1716 revealed that there was a great concern for the limited care with which some early modern knitters treated silk stockings that they made. The merchants complained that knitting women often spoiled the colors and handled the stockings with dirty hands. So what about the construction of stockings then? While documentary evidence indicates that thousands of people knew in the early modern period how to make stockings, the actual making process and the skill required for knitting these historical stockings remains relatively unfamiliar today. In 2019, therefore, we decided to explore further how historical stockings were made by initiating a stocking reconstruction experiment. And to this end, we worked together with 25 volunteer knitting experts who wanted to participate in this research experiment. The silk stocking found in Elisabeth Buure's coffin in Finland provided an ideal case study for our reconstruction because the stocking, firstly, represented an object of high fashion, and secondly, it is in an exceptionally good condition with no visible holes and only a few loose threads. In common with the other silk stockings of high fashion of the period, the design imitated the cut and construction of the traditional cloth stockings. There is a false zigzag seam at the back and decorated clock on the side of the ankle part of the sock. Our research in this experiment started by a close examination of this original item. The length of the stocking measured along the back seam excuse me, from top to the bottom of the back heel was 61 centimeters, and it contained in total over 900 rounds or courses of tiny stitches of thin silk yarn. The knitting was extremely fine. There are as many as 120 rounds by 80 stitches per 10 centimeters. The stocking was knit in the round from the top down in stocking stitch, while all decorative stitches were made with purl stitches. Based on this technical analysis, the most experienced knitters from our volunteers started drafting a knitting pattern, which we can see here. The first step of the reconstruction was then to investigate from what type of silk material the stocking was made of, and to purchase a yarn that was consistent with a historical stocking. We carried out a fiber analysis of a small sample which we had taken from near the opening of the original stocking, and this was analyzed with SEM-EDX analysis at Aalto University nanomicroscopy lab. The results showed that the Turku silk stocking was made of fine, continuous, slightly twisted Bombyx-Mori silk filaments, which was the finest silk yarn available at that date. While our knitters kept working on the pattern, we began to look for a yarn that would resemble this original Bombyx-Mori silk. One of our immediate difficulties was that Bombyx-Mori silk is not available commercially in Europe because the local production was entirely destroyed in Europe between the 18th and 19th centuries due to the Pebrina epidemic that made infected silkworms unable to produce silk thread. In the summer 2019, however, we were fortunate to discover that a small cooperative called Nido di Seta had recently established an experimental small silk farm near the village of San Floro in Calabria, Italy, with an attempt to produce Bombyx-Mori silk in the traditional local way. We participated in one of their workshops at the farm in order to understand how this precious silk thread of the Turku stocking might have been made at the time. The process, in short, involved first placing about 50 silk cocoons in warm water and then brushing them with a special brush. The very fine silk threads of these cocoons were then run together on a reel to make a thread of raw silk. After the silk was dry, the silk skeins were wound and doubled. Our collaboration with Nido di Seta was fruitful, and in the end, we were able to commission from them hand-reeled silk for our reconstruction that corresponded as closely as possible to the authentic silk used in the Turku stocking. To find the right thickness, our volunteer knitters knitted small test swatches using different sets of Nido di Seta yarn. And in the end, we decided that the best results and the right texture could be achieved by reeling together 150 silk cocoon filaments and then give a slight twist to the thread to reinforce it. Although the silk thread made and twisted by hand at Nido di Seta corresponded relatively well with the thickness of the original, producing uniform high-quality silk thread by hand proved to be challenging and required a high level of skill. The finished thread was not entirely even, and in addition, some of the silk strand had glued together during the drying process due to the exceptional humidity in Calabria in 2019. Once we had the yarn, we could then move on to the knitting stage. The knitting stage of the reconstruction started by finding historically appropriate needles. Knitting needles from the period have not survived, but they are often mentioned in early modern archival records and sometimes depicted in paintings, such as in the image by Master Bertram from about 1370, where the Madonna is knitting a pink crimson shirt. So when we were looking for right needles, we had to rely on archival documents. According to early modern records, fine silk stockings were made using 4 thin iron rods. Some documents indicate that good knitting needles had to be long, even and firm, and also a little coarse. The 16th century Song of Knitters by Giovan Battista Gelli, in turn, mentioned that the needle also had to be smooth so that it could move faster. We interpreted this slightly conflicting and confusing information that the needles need to be a little sticky so that they grip the yarn a little, especially when knitting silk, but smooth enough to not snag the fine yarn. The tests made by the knitters indicated that to arrive at the stitch count of the original, we had to use extremely fine needles between 0.7 to 1 millimeters. For the reconstruction, we selected then a set of 5 double-pointed steel needles, which we can see in this picture, with a length of 10 centimeters, which were characterized by a very slim point and good sliding properties. Knitting fine yarn with these thin needles, such as these, made the work challenging for our knitters. When testing these at first in wool, one of the volunteer knitters reported, and I quote, "I started knitting a tiny little swatch with 0.7 millimeter needles and the thinnest wool yarn. The smallest needles I had ever knitted with until then were 1.75 millimeters, and the difference seemed enormous. The needles felt really flimsy and bendy in my hands, but the result was still a fabulously thin and fine piece of knitting with just over 10 loops per centimeter." Although the needles then created beautiful, fine knitted fabric, the modern double-pointed steel needles that we used in this experiment, however, probably did not correspond fully to the early modern iron rods that we found in the documents. They were not as firm as the original knitting needles, and the tips of the needles were so sharp at both ends that many volunteer knitters reported having had to protect their fingers from cuts by using thimbles or covering the fingertips with tape. One of our knitters wrote in her notes, "After 2 hours of knitting, my right hand was tired and the fingertips were very sore." Others found that our needles were too smooth. The stitches tended to fall off at the pointed ends of the needles because the needles were so slippery. One of the participants also reported that one of her needles broke in two on row 160. The thin needles, fine yarn, and the level of detail made knitting fine silk stockings, such as the stocking from Turku, extremely time-consuming. In his Dizionario delle arti de mestieri, written in 1768, the author Grisellini claimed that the hand knitter needed altogether an entire month to knit a pair of silk stockings. Although historians writing on early modern stockings seem to think that such estimates are major exaggerations, our reconstruction of the Turku silk stocking suggests that Grisellini's estimation was probably relatively accurate. Each of the reconstructions of the silk stockings, made exactly to the measure of the original on 1 mm needles, took between 250 to 260 hours to make, meaning one pair would be up to 502 hours. One of the voluntary participants reported that it took her nearly 3 hours just to cast on the required 288 stitches and to knit just the first round. And with a speed of 2.5 hours per day, it took her in total 105 days or 260 hours. She wrote, "For the first 120 courses, my pace was roughly 30 minutes per course. As the stocking progressed, slowly but surely, I managed to pick up a little speed. Normally, I'm a fairly fast knitter, but with the bendy needles and tiny stitches, it was impossible to knit without concentrating all the time. No flow, like with a normal sock, just toiling away, focusing on the knitting." Another knitter reported that the speed of her knitting for the leg part was between 20 and 30 minutes per course in natural daylight, but the work progressed much more slowly when it was dark and she had to knit in artificial light. Some found it especially slow to knit the decorative clocking pattern because, as one of the knitters said, it was difficult to follow the pattern at the same time as she had to keep the tiny pearl stitches tight. Even considering that the early modern professional knitters were probably able to knit much faster than our knitters, all of whom were experienced and highly skilled, but not professionals, it is unlikely that even a skilled early modern hand knitter would have been able to produce multiple pairs of fine silk stockings in a month. The labor-intensive process of knitting silk stockings is also supported by contemporary archival sources, which indicate that the labor costs of fine knitted stockings were high. The surviving account books of Niccolò Capponi, who was a member of one of Florence's oldest and wealthiest families, show that, for example, on 1st of August in 1571, he paid a professional knitter, Antonio Bernardo, 14 lire for making a pair of stockings of local silk, and another 13 soldi and 4 denari for processing and finishing them. The cost of the labor is equivalent of more than 2 weeks' salary of a highly skilled master artisan. Due to the time-consuming process of knitting stockings, it is possible that the labor was divided between several knitters so that the repetitive parts might have been knitted by children, elderly people, or workshop assistants, while the technically more challenging part, that contained many decreases and increases, were completed by the more experienced and skilled knitting masters. A technical examination of the Turku silk stocking showed that there is a change in the pattern of the false zigzag back seam at the head of the clock, which may indicate that the stocking was knit by more than one pair of hands. So now we can move on to the final stage of our reconstruction. During our knitting reconstruction project, we completed in total 4 replicas of the Turku stockings in silk. We also made some wool, but 4 in silk. The finished silk stocking were at first really rough and bulky, as we can see on the image on the left, because silk contains glue-like sericin, which has to be eventually removed. But after the sericin had been removed from the silk and the stocking had been shaped and dried on a wooden sock block, the stockings were transparent and fine, weighing only 30 grams, and they had an incredibly soft, silky texture, as we can see on the right. The color was a beautiful pearl white, and the way the clock pattern reflected light and stood out from the knitted fabric in relief added to the splendor of the look. We were surprised to notice that the silk reconstructions were surprisingly even, despite there have been flaws in our silk yarn. At the finishing stages of the reconstruction, we wanted to bring some of the original colors of the 16th century stockings back to life. An analysis of the colorants of the stocking made in Netherlands showed that although the present color is a dull brown, the stocking had been originally black, which was a color of high fashion in this period. Black was one of the most difficult colors to dye, and the method, in this case probably a method called lasagna, was way too complex and difficult for us to carry out within a university setting. Because we wanted to have a beautiful black, we decided to go instead for the easiest solutions and use logwood, which was the period's new dye source for black, and created easily a good deep black. The end result was good. The deep color combined with the transparent fine knitting made our stocking look similar to the very fine black 16th century stockings depicted, for example, in the image of a hosier painted by Jacopo Coppi in 1580, found today in the Alberto Bruschi da Grasena collection. We also dyed some of the stockings in other colors, such as gold and yellow, in order to bring back to life some of the beautifully and brightly dyed stockings that were recorded in our archival documents. We used natural dyes and standardized historical methods based on recipes from historical dye manuals, such as the Plicto, which is a 16th century dye manual from Venice. This recipe was based on fustic, which we see here, and it was dyed on alum mordanted silk. So here you see some of the some of the process, and then the finished fustic dyed stocking on a sock block. Since silk was treasured not only for its look, but also for its sensory qualities, the very final stage of the experiment was to try on the stocking and to experience how it felt on the body. Although we cannot, as many historians have noted, accurately capture all the nuances of sensations or ideas of comfort in the same way as people 500 years ago, 3 members of our team who tried the delicate knitted silk stocking on agreed that the instant bodily sensation of wearing the finely knitted silk next to the skin was incredibly light and soft and provided an ultimate sense of comfort. So, although a reconstruction, as the historical costume expert Jenny Tiramani has rightly pointed out, is an act of interpretation and never a precise copy, what made our experience of wearing, touching, and looking at the reconstructed silk stockings uniquely close to the authentic is that the actual silk material was produced by hand, using the same breed of silkworms and the same methods and simple local tools that were used in silk production in Italy already in the early modern period. Even the mulberry leaves that were used to feed the silkworms originated from trees that have been growing on the Calabrian soil for centuries. To conclude, The growing popularity and aesthetic appreciation connected with knitted stockings is evident across 16th and 17th century historical, visual, and written evidence. But bringing them to life and learning about making and wearing knitted stockings by observation, hands-on experimentation, and bodily experience allowed us to gain access to the sense of visual, material, and physical splendor of early modern knitted stockings in a way that cannot be really found or captured in books, visual images, or archival records. This material and sensory and experiential knowledge, combined with evidence from traditional historical sources, made it much clearer for us why stockings were so highly prized and why both high-ranking and some of those lower down the social scale were prepared to spend their savings to own at least one pair of silk stockings of fashion. The visual and material elegance of the stockings, their look, physical form, colors, elasticity, and value of labor also made it understandable why the 16th century Queen Elizabeth of England, having tried knitted silk stockings on for the first time in her life, declared, "Henceforth, I will never no more wear stockings of cloth." This reconstruction is just one of the Refashioning the Renaissance project's experiments designed to show how remaking can help us recover knowledge about lost or damaged garments and historical techniques of makings that are not available through historical and archival record. All our reconstructions, experimental results, and archival research findings are available on our website, and they are also published as open access in the Textile History special issue and in our book with Manchester University Press, which includes both scholarly essays and short experimenting focus text on novelty, innovation, and imitation in early modern dress fashions. This project and the publications that have grown from it would not have been possible without our wonderful refashioning team, our voluntary expert knitters, and our project collaboration with numerous colleagues, academics, conservators, scientific technicians, expert citizen makers, and craft specialists. I want to express my deepest gratitude to each one of them. And again, I want to thank Medici Archival Project and all of you for being here this afternoon and for giving me the opportunity to share this work with you. And I'm going to stop sharing now, and at the end of this talk, I would like to show you some of the materials that I have brought here with me. So even though it's very difficult for you probably to see anything, but I have here this original silk stocking in black. So this is the fine silk stocking based on the Turku reconstruction, and I don't know if you can see anything. It's probably not.
Yeah, if you hold it for a few seconds, it will just adjust the camera.
Yeah, it's a little difficult. Maybe if I
yeah,
take
not the I know you showed me the white one before. And with that one I was able to see the patterns.
Okay, let's see.
But maybe not too close to the camera.
Yeah. I think it's about the lighting too, because it's a little dark here now. So
but now I can see.
Yes. So now you can maybe just get a sense of these, and even though you can't see any details of this black stocking, but you can see how incredibly light and fine it is like this. I also brought a little bit of this silk yarn that we commissioned from Nido di Seta. So this is the Bombux Mori silk that is hand reeled by hand, and here are some of the silk cocoons that actually still have the worms inside. You can hear it if I do like this. So these are the cocoons from where the silk was woven. So I have plenty of other materials, but unfortunately, because this talk is not live, it's quite difficult to engage you materially with all these beautiful objects. Thank you very much.
Of course, that was a fabulous talk. Thank you. And before we proceed to the Q&A, I just want to mention that I'm going to provide Professor Hohti's email, even though I saw it at the in the last slide that she shared. And you can send your questions, your follow-up questions directly to her, or you can also send me your questions, and I will forward them to her. But she's been kind enough to share her email, and so you can contact her directly. I truly wish that this could be a live talk, so that this it's like sensing these materials could also expand the understanding of the material culture, of the objects that you showed. But thank you so much for this fabulous talk. I know this is a teamwork, and also I know that you just published a book, Refashioning the Renaissance, everyday dress, in January 2025, if I'm not wrong, correct?
Yes,
Right.
right.
That's the most recent publication on this project.
Yes, it is basically
Okay.
the one of the main outcomes of the project, which summarizes a lot of the findings.
Right. Congratulations. That's fantastic. So because again, this is not a live conversation, I'm going to ask my own questions, but I'm also happy to share others' questions later on. But your project and your study really challenges the elite-centered narratives of the early modern fashion, and this is wonderful. This is really wonderful. So, how do you think this focusing on dress practices of artisans or shopkeepers, everyday people, ordinary people, reconfigure our understanding of a social status in early modern period?
Well, that's quite a big question, but I think it's clear from the sources that we have studied. We have done some extensive archival research also on dress and fashion, also material culture more widely on artisans and other lower social groups. And it's interesting that all this evidence shows that the material culture was much richer than we have assumed, and especially in this period, like during 16th century, when there are a lot of novelties, new innovations, new textile innovations around, that we can really see how the kind of material culture, fashion, the possibility to participate in dress fashions somehow expands. And it's a really exciting period. And of course, this creates a lot of anxiety in society also, because the society was still very hierarchical. It was somehow based on the correct social order, and that people kind of stay there where they belong, and that is also visible through dress. And dress was obviously quite an important visible statement of your status. So in this period, there's a lot of anxiety about that, and it does suggest, and there's many sumptuary laws are published in this period. So of course this kind of suggests that things are getting more complicated in terms of social status. There are a lot of also imitations around, and the imitations, they can be materials like textile materials that imitate more expensive textiles. So there were a lot of fake gems and things like that around. And there were some of them were so skillfully produced that it was so difficult to somehow know which was real or which was not real, that there was a lot of concern about that. Not, of course, only because of status, but it was also an economic issue.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, I have argued in my work that it was still some of these lower class people that we deal with they didn't have the wealth really to compete with some of those like elites who were extremely were really wealthy. So it was maybe more of a competition sort of amongst them and sort of like amongst artisan ranks themselves or like that. So So I think the boundaries were becoming more blurred somehow in the middle. So not in the very top, but somehow like in the middle. So yeah, but it's a very exciting period in terms of material culture, in terms of how lower social groups can start to claim new sense of worth through their dress and through their belongings and like that. Yeah.
Indeed. Absolutely. Yes. So since everyday, clothes didn't survive as much, how did you reconcile the fragmentary, documents, like the materials that you collected? How did you fill the gaps here?
Well, that was one of the main methodological aims of our project, because this Refashioning the Renaissance project was all about looking at how fashion spread in the 16th and 17th century among the more ordinary people. And so one of the really important methodological aims exactly was that what sources do we have in the archives and in museums and in terms of visual and material and archival sources. But then how do we fill the gap? Because as we know, I mean, the sources, archival sources, and also everything in the museum privileges the wealthy segments of society.
Of course.
Yeah, so this is why we were developing methodologies. We had to find out like what do we need first in terms of how can we combine visual, written, and archival documents, and then we brought in this aspect of reconstruction so that we could start testing that when we reconstruct different processes and objects and materials, that how can we fill the gaps of this kind of knowledge that we don't have in museums, in archives. So this is where this knitting experiment project also came from, that it was a way to test that what kind of information can we find out by reconstructing things that don't exist, and how can we use this evidence, like what kind of evidence is it? So yeah.
Right. So how much of this experiment was accessible to scholars or students outside of your research group?
Well, the research was carried out by our own project researchers, but then when we started this particular reconstruction for the knitting, we made a call in Facebook for voluntary knitters, and then so based on those, we had 25 voluntary knitters joining our project. But then we worked in collaboration with a lot of different people from different museums, different projects, conservators, from like technicians. So it was somehow like a big collaboration together. And I mean, there were many people involved. And then we started making this more public through our blog, and we had a knitting channel in Ravelry, and then we had an exhibition at the end of the project to show all the stockings that we made.
Wonderful. That's really fascinating. And there is also a website for that.
Yeah, we have our website, our project website, which records all these experiments, and we made other types of experiments too. We made all kind of testings. So we used, for example, 16th century recipes to create different types of things. For example, imitation pearls, for example. But then we also made a big reconstruction to reconstruct one of the doublets that used to belong to a water cellar from Florence in 1631, and we found this in our document, and the whole project was about that. How can we reconstruct something that is just a line in a document? Like, what do we need? What kind of information we need to gather to do that? And then this reconstruction was in the end made in the London School of Historic Dress. We collaborated with them, so that's also found in our website. So that was also one of the big reconstruction projects.
Right. And that also entailed recreating or reproducing the dyes.
Yes, it was about producing first the fabric, because the fabric was extremely interesting because it was an imitation velvet. So it wasn't real
Mhm.
silk velvet, but it was an imitation velvet made of wool. So it was a woolen velvet, and it was stamped. So instead of being woven with these patterns, which is an expensive and complicated procedure, it was stamped. So it was like one example of those early kind of imitations that
Mhm.
artisans could use, like a cheaper version or something. So we wanted to bring this visible and then visible so that we could explore how could this kind of garment look like? Like, is it
Mhm.
convincing replica, or is it like yeah, so it was actually, I mean, like I said, it's not a copy, or it's not an authentic representation, but it's amazing when we did this project how much information we gained out of it, and when then seeing this object was really touching, because it was really like that, okay, it really could have looked like that. I mean, it really
Right.
clear what is difference between a fine doublet made of real velvet and this imitation piece. So
Yeah, and it's also an immersive experience. I mean, being able to create it and touch it and, feel it, that's also an immersive experience
exactly.
recreated for this.
Yeah, and we had a model
Right.
for this doublet. So he was also experimenting how is it to be bodily sensing this doublet and the making of the doublet. So we made a video that's also available on our website about his like showing the doublet on him, and he then wrote an article about this bodily kind of uh, experience of wearing the doublet. So
Right. Fantastic. So by foregrounding the, clothing of non-elite again, do you see this project as part of a broader project on early modern studies, about the cultural agency of ordinary, both people, materials?
yeah, I mean, the fact is that we still know relatively little about what went on
Mm,
like outside the ranks of the elite. It's understandable because because we don't have so easily the sources available. But if we
mhm,
consider that like the elites, actually the aristocratic elites made a very tiny population, actually, like of the whole Italian
mhm.
population, then like yeah, we can really understand that our history has been studied like through a very narrow lens, that there's so much to discover, like what went really on in the everyday life of uh, like Italians. So there's still a lot of work to do, and I hope we
Of
find
course.
new sources and new methods to access these like ranks outside the rich and powerful.
Right. Now, I know that you are now currently in Florence, but where are your teammates? Where are the other members of this group project? Where is this project based?
Well, the project itself has ended now. So the project ended in 2022, and
Hmm.
so after this, all my team members were employed elsewhere. So one of them works at the Stefania Montemezzo, works at the University of Padova, and Sophie Pittman works in let me think now. In the States, she's directing a textile collection in, was it in, now I forget where, but
It's okay.
yeah, and yeah, and
Okay.
yeah, so people have spread like in different jobs, but I think we still keep in touch, and I think many of us are still interested in a little bit of these like lower classes, and in some of these things that are not like like maybe always the first grade, but secondary grade, and interested in the not just the what it meant economically, or yeah, but especially like what it meant culturally, like what was the broader cultural and social meaning of that.
Okay, wonderful. Now my next question is about gender. Um, does does your do your findings suggest that men and women who engaged with fashion had different access? Or was like gender any kind of like an influential element here in terms of access to these materials?
Mm, well, uh, both had access, men and women. Of course,
Equally?
well, of course, in this period, this patriarchal system made it sure that it was like usually property was totally controlled by men, and at least formally was controlled by owned and controlled by men. But women had their dowries when they got married, so that was
Mhm,
also legally
mhm,
theirs. So yeah, and usually some of the quite valuable clothing was included in the dowry. But the
mhm,
inventories that we look at, it's quite difficult sometimes to tell which one belongs to the man or to the woman, because the documents don't always specify. The garments could be called the same, but they like
mhm,
yeah. So it's a difficult question, but
mhm,
yeah, there have been studies that like show that like in at least in some noble families that women can be quite powerful in making actually like behind the scenes, making the decisions of households and what are purchased, and so organizing all this. But of course, in the end, in this period, it was the man who owned the property and probably had the final word.
So in other words, gender shaped access to materials and skills, also, aesthetic choices.
Yeah, yeah. And in this period, I mean, women were somehow like wives of men were somehow regarded their representation of their status. So somehow women always represented their husbands or their families. So in that sense, it was like, yeah, quite conditioned by gender.
Right. And this is probably my last question. Let me check time. Yes, we only have 2 more minutes. So do you think that trade had any kind of impacts on the circulation of these materials, skills, and access?
Trade. Did you ask?
Trade, yes.
Yeah.
Importing, exporting of any of these materials.
Yes, very big role. I mean, this was a period like with extensive and expanding trade, and with huge numbers of new materials
Mhm,
sort of introduced, and then like maybe first like a lot of things imported and then applied into local production. So this was really a period when there were so many new innovations, lots of trade, things and people moved around and circulated knowledge and skills. So it had a huge impact on what was happening in dress and fashion and in people's
mhm,
lives in their access to new materials and cheaper materials and
mhm.
yeah.
And I know that because your study is more focused on non-elite, do you think that the growing silk industry in Florence had any impacts on this, on the production of ordinary coats?
Yes, especially
Mm,
like in this period, especially how how these kind of cheaper mixed fabrics that mixed silk with another type of material like flax or
mm,
cotton or wool, um,
mhm.
or using silks that were made of waste silks, so spun silks, which were like second grade or inferior silks, and so huge impact.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I definitely wanted to just go on and on and on. And you have been very patient to answer all my questions. Thank you again, Professor Hohti, for joining us. And I know it was a challenge to coordinate everything, but I'm so glad it finally worked out. And I'm very grateful to have you, and we hope to have you again in the future. Good luck with the rest of this project, and I wish you a very good evening.
Thank you. Thank you again. And for everyone who's watching this, feel free to send me email. I'm sorry I'm not here to answer questions in person, but I'm happy to answer your queries through email. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Next week, same time, same link will work for the next talk, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much, Professor Hohti. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.